Welcome and thank you for joining us online. I'm Natalie Teitler, the manager of the Jerwood Compton Poetry Fellowships, and I'm very pleased to be joined by our current fellows, Hafsah Aneela Bashir, Anthony Joseph, and Yomi Sode, for the first of our Poetry Takeover events to discuss and share the art that kept the fellows going during 2020, including music, film, Netflix, and poetry, of course, for a celebration of the uplifting power of art and poetry in particular. For those of you who've only just learned about the Jerwood Compton Poetry Fellowships, they are a significant new development opportunity for poets, and they support individuals whose practice encompasses poetry in the broadest artistic sense. The Jerwood Compton Fellowships are designed and managed by Jerwood Arts with support from Arts Council England, including funds from the Joseph Compton bequest. For September and October 2020, we've invited the Jerwood Compton Poetry Fellows to take over the Jerwood Arts channels. The fellows joining me today are celebrating the end of an amazing year of mentorship, reflection, and development through the fellowship program, with this new digital program of online events, content, and social media takeovers. Through the program, they are presenting new work, testing fresh ideas and formats for poetry online, as well as engaging in critical conversations about what poetry can be and is today. Before we get into this discussion, I thought I'd take a moment to introduce each and every one of the fellows and their practices. Hafsah Aneela Bashir is a Manchester-based poet, playwright, and performer, originally from East London. She is currently developing new work for the Takeover Festival and has recently launched the Poetry Health Service, project delivering poetry panaceas by the people for the people. Anthony Joseph is a Trinidad-born poet, novelist, and musician. He's the author of 4 poetry collections and 3 award-winning novels. As a musician, he has released 7 critically acclaimed albums, and in 2020 received a Paul Hamblin Foundation Composers Award. Yomi Sode was born in Oyo State, Nigeria, and lives in London. He's been performing poetry for over 10 years. Highlights include opening for Saul Williams and The Last Poets, with appearances at Yahoo, Wireless Festival, Latitude, Love Box, Olympic Village, Sadler's Wells Theatre, as well as working with Channel 4 and BBC Radio 1 Extra. Yomi founded Boxed In 2012, a quick-fire free poetry night at Box Park in Shoreditch. Right, so we're going to get started, and I'm going to start by saying, first of all, welcome and thank you for joining us, Anthony, Yomi, and Hafsah. We're going to start with something a little bit easier just to ease everybody in. So, and try to be honest, when lockdown was first announced and when it first started, what was the first art form that you remember turning to and enjoying? So was it film, was it music, was it Netflix, was it poetry? You can include guilty pleasures. So I don't know who wants to start. I see Hafsah smiling, so maybe she's going to start.
That's because I don't want to confess what my guilty pleasure was. But anyway, I turned to the great library of our times and watched a lot of Netflix. I felt like I couldn't really concentrate on anything else. And so some of the shows that I watched Money Heist. And I also watched How to Get Away with Murder, all the seasons. I absolutely loved that. It was good seeing Viola Davis, strong Black woman, leading that show. I also sadly watched a reality show called Selling Sunset. And that was always on sometimes in the background of what I was doing. And I remember turning to a film called The Platform. I don't know if anybody's seen it. But it's basically really, it was for me quite reflective of people's behavior during lockdown and us as society consuming more than we need. So I won't spoil the ending, but those are some of the things that I was doing. I also watched a Pakistani drama called Dastan because I had my grandmother and my mum staying with me during lockdown. and it was a drama about the partition. So that gave us lots to talk about.
Fantastic. Yomi, do you want to jump in?
I was a mixed bag, you know. I was Netflix. I was Netflix, definitely Netflix. I think the only show that I binged was You, because I've heard so much about it over time. And then I was like definitely engrossed in this character and the build up of this character. So that was me. Music I listened to a lot of, but not so much any specific artist, but I just joined in a lot of the playlists. So I was just listening to random playlists on my on just the music platform that I have on my phone. Well, that was quite the experience, because there was new tunes that I hadn't heard of, and especially within the time the whole formatting of First Five was happening. So I was getting in tune with new sounds that I just wasn't open to beforehand, and was really like kind of keen in listening to. But I think what absolutely took over my lockdown, at least the beginning part of it, was a lot of techie stuff. I bought so much tech stuff just to try and make sense of how do you broadcast stuff online. And then now I had to make myself comfortable. Do I need to buy this kind of folding desk, because I can't go into my members place to write no more. So I have to turn certain parts of my home environment into my writing space, my mobile writing space. So how do I do that? So the first part of lockdown was a bit of a nightmare in just trying to figure out what my creative process was going to be like. And if I'm honest with you, there were a lot of return items to a lot of these places I bought stuff from, because it just wasn't working out until maybe 2 months later that I finally figured it out. So that was very consuming, but it was fun at the same time as well. So yeah, it was me.
Anthony, I'm guessing everybody thinks you're going to be immersed in music. So
yeah, more or less. I mean, it's interesting that you were talking to poets and no one says, oh yeah, I started reading a lot, you know. It was the same for me. I think the reading came after, but yeah, initially it was music. Suddenly I realized I had all this time, and you know, you're lost in this sea of time, and you're like, oh, what's going to happen, you know? So I was able then to sort of slowly but surely get into a lot of the stuff that I hadn't listened to, like records that I'd bought and just put down and didn't really pay attention to. Now I could, you know, listen to them, pay attention. So it gave me that time to catch up on my listening. And also, yeah, a little bit of Netflix. I'm not too into Netflix, but I did watch a series called Ozark, which I kind of got hooked on, and I kind of binged in there. Right?
Very violent.
Bits of some of it is, yes, you know. But yeah, that was the only thing. That was the only sort of visual, like TV-based thing that I did. The rest was just music, yeah, listening to records.
And you mentioned something about poetry, that maybe it wasn't the first thing that you turned to. And we're going to talk about that a little bit more in a minute, but I'm quite curious if anybody wants to jump in and say why it wasn't the first thing. It wasn't for me either. I couldn't cope with it for the first like month or two. Anything written I couldn't cope with. Anthony, Yomi?
I can say a bit. Yeah, it wasn't for me because poetry demands a kind of attention and a kind of focus and concentration for me. So it's poetry, you know, as we'll discuss later on. I mean, for me, poetry returns me to myself. It makes me contemplate myself a lot, my own emotions, my own experiences. You know, whatever poetry I read, it returns me to something inside. And I definitely didn't want to sort of start doing that at the beginning of lockdown. That I had to take a time to get to that. Initially, we were looking for answers like everybody else. And, you know, we were looking outside of ourselves for the answers. I didn't want to look too far into myself at that point. So that's why I didn't turn to poetry. Eventually I did, but at the beginning, not so much, no.
Interesting.
I was reading a lot of nonfiction. I was reading a lot of nonfiction, at times fiction. Poetry was that, because I'm currently working on my first collection. So for me, I was so immersed in the writing process that I almost didn't want to return to reading poetry if I'm writing poems already. So I was just like, where can I give myself a bit of a break? So I was going into other worlds instead. So I was going into the non-fiction world and I was going to the fiction world. And occasionally I would return to reading a collection. But for the most time, it was, these were the especially in light of everything that happened this year with the whole Black Lives Matter movement. I was getting back to British or natives. I was reading a lot of these kind of, which in a way fueled more writing, and then gave me the opportunity to then dip into other poetry collections as well. But yeah, that was my starting point in terms of readership. That was my first kind of open lane in terms of where I was going.
And I think I'm very similar to what Anthony was saying, is that I found it very difficult when lockdown was first enforced, that, things felt so different. I went through this kind of numbness initially, and then it was, how do I keep my family safe? And that just took over everything. I had to come to some sort of understanding about what this stealth enemy is that's out there, that's, we're all having to protect ourselves from. But not only for ourselves, but obviously I'm a mother of 5 children, and then I have my community. So me reading any kind of poetry at that time, at the very beginning, just seemed really impossible to do. And then obviously that changed over the course of lockdown.
It wasn't happening. I remember even as, and speaking, on my side, it was a thing of, there's really no room to write. Even if you're reading, you're lucky, because shopping you need to make sure the shopping is there, because the house needs food, and then you go to the supermarket and it's just empty, so certain things needed prioritizing, and at that point it just wasn't, it wasn't the writing, and it wasn't the dipping into these books. These things needed prioritizing first.
And even our space, suddenly it wasn't as if we're working from home. It very much felt like we're now going to have to live at work. How do you arrange your house so that you're giving everybody space? And you're right, when you said you're right, the place where you used to write from, now that's changed as well. So yeah, there was a lot more that needed to be prioritized before any of us could sit down with, I think that's carried through for me. I don't know about anybody else, but I think I managed 1 poem in the whole of lockdown.
Wow.
Yeah, that's how much it affected me. I did other things and I did other creative work, but in terms of writing poetry, I managed 1 poem through that time.
Interesting. For me, I wrote a lot. Actually. It was eventually it became a very creative time for me. So at the beginning, in the first couple of weeks, it was, sort of floundering, not knowing which direction to take. But I started a journal. I started writing every morning, doing morning pages again, so I would write for half an hour in the morning, just freehand. And eventually that writing became poetry. So I found my way back into writing. And that became like the centerpiece of my day. So I did write a lot, and I was, working on a series of sonnets and stuff like that. And so lyrics and everything. Yeah. So I ended up being very creative, at the peak of the lockdown. Yeah. I was writing all the time.
Mm.
And you find that your writing had changed at all, that it was influenced by lockdown or Black Lives Matter or any of the political stuff that was going on? Or was it more you just put yourself in a creative bubble and did what you needed to do?
I have a thing that I don't know where I get this idea from, but for all of my writing, I try not to date the work. So there's very little reference in the work to what is actually going on in the society around me, in terms of news stories, or you would never find Facebook or iPhones mentioned in any of my in my work. I don't know. I just like it to stand outside and be kind of timeless. So yes, emotionally, there's elements in there that you can sense, a sense of restriction or compression in the work. So yes, and a lot of introspection and a lot of nostalgia. There's a lot of that in there, but it is not addressing, it's not saying, oh, this is the 5th day of lockdown and I'm doing this and blah, blah, blah. But in terms of changing it, not really. I mean, it just gave me, because of all the time and the space, I sort of indulged myself a lot more in writing about things in a way as if no one was ever going to read it. You know what I mean? So I just felt like I was free to sort of write the unwritable, you know.
Well, that's
I haven't necessarily marked, you know, so I love the process Anthony just spoke about. Like, imagine reading something, it's not even stamped or marked in that sense. That for me is awesome. While a lot of influences as a lot of stuff has happened this year alone, I haven't necessarily written a specific piece in relation to Black Lives Matter or to any of the stuff that's been happening, not even COVID for the most part. However, I've referenced elements of what's happened through the year as like a buffer for this overall context of what it is that I am writing, because in some way it's not lost in translation. It's just, if anything, it's almost added more spice, if anything, to what I'm writing. It's just kind of proving more evidence to what I'm writing. So without necessarily honing too much attention on this one thing, here's this big thing that I'm writing, but here comes this situation to say, oh, look, oh, by the way, here's a reference point. And then we just carry on from there. And that I've found that to be a very useful tool through the process of my own writing.
okay. So it sounds like, you know, people responded very differently, which I'm kind of hearing across the spectrum of other artists as well. So some people felt really inspired and other people were finding it really, really difficult to write. Can we just get back a little bit to the reading of poetry as well? Because obviously most of the people listening are not actually poets, so they won't be writing, but they will be reading, or hopefully reading. So Hafsah, I wanted to start with you because you were talking about some of the difficulties of writing poetry, but I know you became a very, very avid reader. So can you say first, what were the first poetry books that you turned to during lockdown?
Well, one of the things that I did decide to do is question my platforms, and then thought, what is it that I'm good at that I can offer right now? And one of that was reading to the public. And so when you say to me what were one of the first few collections, what actually ended up happening was an hour a day I would read into the void. I felt like it was the void. I just went on my Insta account, and every day at 2 o'clock, I would read for an hour short stories and poetry. I started that on the 28th of March, and I carried that on for 75 days. And I would read short stories, blogs, and shared poems from lots of different writers of colour, national, local, and international poets. In the end, I think I must have shared 72 authors' works and over 110 poets. So some of the collections that really stood out to me, I think, or some poetry that really stood out to me at that time was, and I think this stayed with me through the whole of lockdown, was Danusha Lamiris's poetry collection. It's called The Moons of August, and she's a Californian poet. And one of her poems is called Small Kindnesses. And that poem really resonated with me through lockdown because at the beginning, I remember just how people, this scramble for sustenance, you know, everybody thought we were going to run out. And, you know, there were these levels of, you know, cruelty and fear that were going on, that were being reported in the media. But actually, every time I referenced that poem, Small Kindnesses, she just talked about the ordinary, everyday things that we can do for each other that are so powerful. And so that stayed with me through the lockdown. Other collections, I don't know if I'm saying her name properly, but Eve Ewing, I think her second name is. And she has a collection called Electric Arches. And she's an absolutely brilliant Black poet. And what she retells stories, but what I loved about her collection is every time you got to some tension of an event in the poem, suddenly the rest of the poem would be written in italics, and it would be her imagination taking you off somewhere else. And it was just that form of poetry that I absolutely it just really resonated with me, because there's so many times where you want to be carried away. And so that was one of the collections that I really enjoyed. I did a lot of revisiting to poetry collections as well. Claudia Rankine's Citizen, I remember going back to that, and Danae Smith's collection as well. I remember rereading those. So they were some of the ones that I came across. I have a whole list, a whole 259-page document. That's the long answer.
That's amazing. I mean, that's a huge time commitment as well, because presumably, as well as the 1 hour broadcast, you also had to prepare everything every day.
Yeah, but it gave me focus, Nat. That's the thing. I realized actually that just that preparation for that 1 hour got me up, got me changed, gave me something to do during the day, widened my reading, which is something that I wanted to do through this fellowship anyway. And also what I realized is I thought I was reading into the void, but actually the response that I got from the public was so beautiful that it became the roots for 2 projects quite organically. I invited people to write haikus, people that had never wrote poetry before. They would send me those haikus. I would tag in the poetry that inspired them. That would then be shared on my Instagram account. And people that had never wrote poetry before were suddenly finding that haiku format easy to express how they felt. And in a way, that's what helped me. It was the only form that I could write through. Anything else just felt too much. But I had books being sent to me through the post, people asking me to read things out. And from that, the Poetry Health Service was born. So even though I say that I didn't write poetry, I did other creative things that still kind of provided healing in that time.
Sure. I mean, it was a beautiful project, those 75 days, and we are going to be talking about it at length in a future event. So I'm very excited about that. Yomi, can you say a little bit about the poetry books that you turned to when you were ready to read?
Early doors, when it was time to now, like, okay, cool, let's crack on with poems. I'm like, okay, and I think this was the beautiful part in terms of what COVID, the time that it allowed, because beforehand I was just finding myself not having a space because I'm just reading these books that were pertaining to the work that I was working on, whereas I wasn't taking time to just read books that I just want to just sit down and just enjoy. So I remember picking Dinesh Smith's Homie book, and I was like, okay, let's get into this. I've had this book for ages. Let's crack on, let's read. And I really enjoyed the premise of the book. In a sense, it kind of proposed itself in terms of like, I'm just going to talk about friends. I'm just going to talk about these situations that pertaining with my friends and what have you. And I liked the subtleness of that, but also there was parts in which it can get really deep because you know what you go through with your friends, you know the ups and downs, you know what you want to explore. And I'm also looking for different areas of what to talk on sometimes, and that was really important. So I went from Dinesh's book to Serge J. Bernard's book, because then this was more around, okay, let's now do some research type work. This is research based, and the skill of the writer in actually bringing this to the forefront for the masses to pay attention to. And I really, really, really enjoyed the process of it, not necessarily feeling like this big thesis, but still working within the craft of poetry and writing on that. There were some anthologies I picked up again, the Forward anthologies I picked up, the Blood Axe anthology, not the Staying Alive ones. Like there's different titles that they had, but I picked up those anthologies over time because I went back to grassroots in terms of thinking, okay, cool, the ways for me to find out writers that I'm going to buy a collection from is going into anthologies, and if I like the works of the poet in the anthology, then I'm like, okay, cool, where can I find your work online? How can I now find out more about you? So I found myself going back into a lot of anthologies, a lot of African anthologies as well, and seeing how to now pick my writer out of that. And then I'm not sure if we're going to talk on First Five later, but for me, a step forward from that was now it will be interesting to talk about the writer or talk to the writers as opposed to reading their work. So I've read your work. Now can I actually talk to you on a one-to-one basis? Well, I say one-to-one, but it's via live. And if I remember reading Sean Hewitt's collection, Tongues on Fire, and then Tongues of Fire, yeah, and then getting into a conversation with Sean. I was like, oh, I just read your book like last week, and now I'm talking to you about your book and about you as well. So that process for me was beautiful in terms of, okay, how can I now lift this out of the page and talk to the actual person, get to know a bit more about them. And all of it was just a beautiful process for me, if I'm honest.
That's a really interesting thing, because with you, Yomi, and also with Hafsah, your reading kind of segued into actually creating something. So for you, Yomi, it was this first live where you got into a more in-depth view with the poets that you were reading. And for Hafsah, it was, she created various things around haikus and then the Poetry Health Service. So it became this kind of very, very creative process as well.
And shared experiences in a sense, because some of the poets I was speaking to, they too shared a similar anxiety in terms of what happens next. You know, conversations went from, how did you get a title for your book? What was that process like? Because I'm also going through the process of writing my first collection. So there's a lot of learning for me here to be had. But then it went from title of your book to what's this, what does this look like outside of lockdown? You know, I'm hearing there's rumors and saying we're not going to be doing live gigs again until next year's summer. So how does the poet survive in a world where almost people consider poetry as the last thing, you know? So what happens in the survival mode of the poet in these times? So it was a lot of discussions being had, and it was a really good space to just kind of share the anxieties and the thoughts and the excitements and whatever this is birthed out of lockdown, you know?
Yeah, amazing. So Anthony, I don't think we've heard from you yet. We know that you wrote a lot. Were you also reading quite a bit during that time?
Yes, a bit. You know, when I started reading poetry again, I guess within the beginnings of the lockdown, I turned to Yusef Kumunyaka, who's Scandalized My Name, which is a selected poems collection. Yusef he's African-American poet who, when I first started, well, I guess taking poetry seriously as a career and as a life, when I realized that I was going to be poor for the rest of my life by being a poet, back in the early 90s, Yusef Kumunyaka was one of the first people that I turned to, and one of the first poets that I learned a lot from about voice. So this was the first thing that I pulled off the shelf. I've had it for many years, but I pulled it off and I started rereading Yusef and just looking at the way he uses voice and form and the sort of combination of finding a voice, finding a form that matches the content of what he was saying. I'm very interested in that. So I was reading him a lot and just rereading poems by him that I loved. And also reading the Maximus poems, Charles Olson. I recommend it, but it's about 600 pages long. But Olson spent about 10 years. It was like almost 10 or I think more than 10 years, like 20 years working on these poems. And there's life's work. He was an American poet, wrote a very important essay called Projective Verse, in which he says that we need to, if you want to write about a flower, go to the flower. Let the flower determine what form its poem should look like. You know, that's kind of summing up Projective Verse in a small sense. he was trying, I guess, to break away from the idea that a poet has inspiration from form or from what's gone before, and then you take this form and you adapt it to whatever subject. He's like, no, let's turn it around and let's go from the subject, catch the energy of the subject, bring it into yourself, and then put it back out into a form. So yeah, but I think we all do that. I think as poets, that's the kind of mode that we write in now. So I was reading him a lot. And also, this is not quite poetry, but it's kind of poetry. The Little Zen Companion. I found this very helpful. Actually, some of it is haiku and some of it is like very short little koans and little things to think about. And that kept me going. It was just lying around the house. I could pick it up, open it up at random, and I could read a quote or a little line of poetry, a little philosophy. I found that helpful and comforting. Yeah.
So it sounds like obviously everybody was both reading and creating quite a bit around this time. I'm curious because we've heard a lot in the press and online about the cuts in the arts, and we're going to talk about that a little bit more later. But I know that all three of you still had quite a few commissions to do public work. And obviously we've said that the live events weren't happening. So can you talk a little bit about the commissions that you were receiving and if they changed during this time? Hafsah, I know you said that you weren't writing poetry, but you were writing quite a bit. You're writing a libretto, I believe, as well as some other projects. So if anybody wants to kick in and start talking about some of the poetry commissions they were getting, how they were different from what you'd had before, because presumably they were online, and also in the topic, if that was different. Yomi, do you want to kick off? Because I know you've had some quite political commissions.
Yes, and I think it touches on Anthony's point earlier in terms of dating and stamping, because the most recent commission that I received had a definite date stamp on it. It was one of them, if anything, is one of the most iconic images of the year in regards to Patrick Hutchinson when the EDL kind of bombarded a peaceful BLM march in central London, and Patrick carrying the EDL member out of what would have been him potentially being more harmed in a situation. And the South Bank emailed to ask if I was interested in writing a response to this image. And you know, it's rule of six hopefully being lifted by that point. In some point later this year, it will be read and before an audience, hopefully. It was a tricky one because it pulls in all these different strands of politics in terms of how I feel, in terms of how the community feels in regards to the image, and also how to now, to a certain degree, convey that through a poem. I've written it. I keep looking at it every single day. It's almost like my shadow. I keep looking at it. I'm just like, what more do you want to say? Do you have anything more to say? Are you ready to speak loud? Are you ready for the feedback and everything? It's been a very, very interesting process. But at the same time, I think back to when the whole COVID, when everything was announced and the postponed gigs, the cancelled gigs was coming in, and just the impact that had financially in regards to work, the impact that it had financially in regards to, okay, how do I think going forward? And the amount of the levels of organizations I was coming through with some work for me to do every now and then, I'm very thankful to them. So this definitely took time for me to sit on, and I'll be interested in hearing some of from the other fellows in regards to some of the work that they've been asked to do, and how they processed that whole, their position in the situation, how they went forward with it. Because for me, it took me quite some time, and it took a lot of conversation with the institution in terms of, why is this important? Why is it that you want to talk about this? And why would you ask me to do this? And how do we go forward? And if I do go forward, I wouldn't necessarily want to be censored in what it is I have to say as a writer. And that it was a lot of back and forths before we got to a final point and we carried on with the project.
Was that the hardest commission that you think you had during this period? Because I know you've had quite a
Wow.
few.
So far, yes, because of just how where politically where it stands, you know, because I kind of liken it to I liken it to Marmite, because some people take to it, some people don't. Do you see what I mean? I don't know. So I don't know. It is what it is. But I feel like the image is saying so much, and it's just one of the images that you know, for me, the equivalent of that is just trying to kind of list your top five, top three rappers ever. And it's just going to have everybody in a whirl, because everybody's just going to have all different options. Like everyone's going to be saying different things. Nobody's going to agree. And I think with this image, nobody agrees to the one thing. Everyone's always going to have a different opinion. So to now ask of me to make some sense of it, I have to take a completely different view of that. I will decline any offer for anyone to try to ask me to write about Black History Month. Why? Because it's a whole month. Like, what? How can I talk about Black history in like 3 minutes or 4 minutes of a poem? I will pick specific parts of it to talk on, for example. So to talk about an image like this, it requires a specific lens and the angle in the way in which one goes into it, as opposed to just trying to write about everything to try to please all the different voices speaking on it. So yes, it's been a difficult process. It's been definitely the most difficult commission to date, if I'm to be honest with you.
And do you think that your commissions have become more political during this period and requiring you to be politically engaged with events that are going on, particularly Black Lives Matter?
I wouldn't necessarily want to be the talking point like that in terms of like more commissions like that coming my way, because I too still have to process trauma. I still have to go to sleep at night. I still have to kind of go through my day to day. And you know, it's one person kind of saying, oh, I commission you to write about this, but they're not necessarily thinking about it in the same way that I have to think about it. And there's a responsibility in terms of, I feel there's a responsibility for those asking or commissioning people to write about things and think about what that process is like for the writer to actually take stock of everything and write on it. You know, I think there's a huge responsibility there. Um, and and the aftercare, like what happens, it's one thing to be like, oh, I commission you to write about this, it's written about, okay, see you later, thank you for doing that amazing job, and there's no aftercare involved. I think there is a responsibility for institutions that are kind of asking of writers to do these things on a constant basis. I'm early doors in my age out here. There's only so much gray hairs I can welcome in my life right now. You know, I don't need additional stress off the back of people trying to almost leverage on specific moments that are happening. I still have a life that I have to protect as well, and a community as well, most importantly.
I'm hearing from artists kind of in every genre, Black artists in particular, that they are being asked to do quite difficult, complex and painful things. So I think that is a trend, and it is really, really important to protect yourself. And it's interesting as well what you were saying about the aftercare, because I don't think that institutions and organizations are getting involved enough in what happens afterwards. There's a recent example of Diversity, the dance group on Britain's Got
Yeah.
Talent, and they did a piece about BLM, which was really great. And I think they've had a record number of complaints.
15,000, I think, yeah.
Yeah, 15,000. And they also had, you know, really, really horrible messages online, on Twitter, everywhere. And I really didn't feel that they had been protected, because it was obvious to anybody that there was going to be a response.
Yeah.
And I don't think they kind of took the precautions that they should have taken.
Yeah,
So that's really interesting.
Off the back end is very simple. You know, if you're asking this of Black artists specifically, protect on the back end in terms of the aftercare, pay them for their time, for the amount of times and what they're putting in, because a lot of the time things are being asked of Black artists, especially within this time, and they are not paid fairly or reasonably well in regards to what is being asked of them. And it it then just reiterates what this movement is, or part of the movement is about, in terms of there's this kind of pillaging of information and being used, but then at the same time it's not being respected. And that is just like a minute thing of like various other things that are kind of part of what this movement is actually trying to kind of drum into the ears of institutions and organizations and people as a whole, I feel.
Yeah, and it's a really interesting point, because I think it goes across the board that arts organizations and other entertainment channels as well are aware that arts are very important, that there's going to be a huge audience, and that it is the arts have a role to play in responding to political issues, but they're not willing to really fund that or support that.
Yeah.
So it's like, oh, we're going to the funding, but we still think that the artists are the foremost people for responding to this situation. So there's a little bit of a conflict there, I think, as well.
Yeah.
So Hafsah, can you say a little bit about some of the commissions you've had during this time, and if they were slightly different from what you'd had before? I mean, I'm guessing they would be, because they would have to be for things that were more online than before.
Yeah, and initially, to be honest, when I was worried about work drying up, suddenly our sector was hit the most, and I had bills to pay, and I just didn't know now what my practice is going to be, because things have changed so much. And when the commission, I was still trying to process that when I was being asked to do commissions. And I remember initially opening my laptop, reading, and then just shutting my laptop again. I just thought, actually, I can't do this right now. And I remember initially, it's not just in the arts sector, but I've got, children that some of them are working, some of them are at universities. And it was across the board that people at the top of these inherently white institutions were not looking after people of color. And suddenly there was a lot of work being done by the students themselves, notably one of my children. A lot of work was and is being asked of her to try and help these institutions bring about change, but then they're not paying them for that work. It's consultancy work, it's where resources, and a lot of my time was spent in that. So when I did accept a commission, I was quite lucky in the sense that it was left to me to decide what it was that I wanted to create or develop. So when the PHS came out, Poetry Health Service, that was a given. I wanted to create something that would share poetry by the people, for the people, amongst each other for free. And I did a festival in my house with Manchester International Festival. Again, that was a conversation generated from the Insta Live talks that I had been doing, so contacts that I had made with poets abroad. So I spoke to this a Black Muslim poet in America called Aisha Sharif. And we had a conversation about the P word. So all things, poetry, pandemic, all sorts of things that came under that. So that was quite easy to do. And then I was asked about this libretto. I was approached by a company that asked me to write a libretto that spoke to lockdown. And coming from the community that I come from, there was no way that I could make something without thinking about how COVID-19 had affected Black and brown communities the most, and disproportionately, and I could see that. And it really started to make me think about, especially after the George Floyd murder and the Black Lives Matter movement, of who is able to breathe in peace. With that comes some privilege. And so the idea of the piece is called The Bridge Between Breaths. And it takes this notion of us being connected by this universal breath. But it was lots of vignettes of conversations that I had heard over lockdown. The 13-year-old boy dying by himself in hospital, even though the government had said that, young people are not affected. The medics that were dying on the front line, the care work in the care homes, all these kind of conversations that were happening around me. And then the Edward Colston statue came down. And I thought to myself, actually, the story that I want to write about is Pero Jones, this man that was owned by a slave owner in the 18th century and set in Bristol. And with that came a lot of questioning about my own position as a South Asian Muslim female writing this story. And I think the whole of lockdown made me think about my position and the spheres that I move in and the things that I could be doing. So that was quite challenging for me in the sense that when I knew that I wanted to write this piece, but I wanted to do it with sensitivity, there was always the question in my head was, am I the right person to write this piece? And for me, I wanted to look for creative Black leadership on that piece. And the company, I remember sitting in the Zooms and feeling uncomfortable trying to have these conversations, but they were very open to it. And in the end, we had the R&D for this last week. The libretto that I wrote was done with sensitivity, with a lot of collaboration, because I will have gaps in my knowledge. And I hope that we've done the piece justice. It's a collaborative piece between all of us. But I think that's one of the most challenging commissions that I've ever wrote, because I think it was a big learning curve for me as well.
Interesting. Anthony, did you have any commissions during this time, or were you trying to just get on with your own work? I know you had a huge amount to do.
Yeah, no, I had a few things. It's really interesting hearing people talk about this. It's almost as if, I mean, I've told her this for a while, that, you know, as a Black writer or person of color in that way, you're expected to go through the trauma and then create art out of that trauma as well, you know? So that's interesting, and that's something that keeps reoccurring. So yeah, I had a few things. I mean, it's all, some of them, you know, going through my whole career, there's always been an attempt by, I don't know, by interviewers or academics or businesses to sort of corner you and get you to make a statement, you know, to speak, to be a spokesperson, you know, and I understand that that's how it goes. Sometimes these people don't have any other tools, you know, so this is the only tool they have. What do you think about Black Lives Matter? What do you think about this? What do you think about that? And that's fine. I think it's okay, you know, and I find a way to sort of cope with it. I guess I'm trying to think of if I've had anything that was specifically trying to corner me in that direction. I mean, I'm doing a talk. Sorry.
Sorry, the question was really just about any commissions that you've had during this time. What was coming to you from art organizations? Because I think a lot of people think that poetry and the arts have kind of slowed down. But there's actually a lot of activity going on.
Well, okay, I did something for Bocas Lit Fest in Trinidad, which was a reading and an interview, which was quite fun because I got to talk about my new novel. That was quite interesting. I've been asked to go on to the BBC to do a couple of radio shows, to do a couple of interview things, which again turned very, you know, very pinpointed on particular events that were going on, you know. But what's interesting as well is that I'm a lecturer too. So at DMU, we are suddenly now in a situation where we're beginning to talk about decolonizing the syllabus. So there's been some events and meetings around that. And that's been interesting, speaking to my colleagues about, you know, because it's not something that we've ever spoken about before. And all of a sudden you're in this situation where they're coming to me and saying, what can we do? So that's been an interesting, it's not really a commission, but they've because I'm the only Black person on the team, they look at me to like, what do you want? What should we do here? So that's been interesting. So I've been suggesting, how do we look at changing reading lists? What do we do? How do we, you know, bring authors in? How do, you know, so that's been interesting. Besides that, I've done a couple of things for Speaking Volumes, responding to a couple of films, writing poetry inspired by these films. And yeah, just ticking along, just getting on with my work.
Obviously, at the beginning of lockdown, I spoke to a lot of poets and artists who were really worried that they weren't going to have any work. And actually, it kind of picked up quite quickly. And there seems to be a lot of creativity, a huge amount of art being produced at this time. I know that, for example, the National Theatre, they put some of the plays online. And I think Inua Ellam's Barbershop Chronicles had 500,000 views. And Sadler's Wells also put a huge amount online. And has had millions of views all over the world. So I think people are starting to realize that there are possibilities actually for the arts to kind of grow during this time. So the numbers as well for people reading have gone up absolutely massively this year. So what is it that you think the art can do for people during this time? We've talked a little bit about escapism. I think we've talked a little bit about human connection. But what is it that you think is making people really need art at this time, or poetry? Because Hafsah, you were saying that your poetry responses have had a lot of things going on. So does anybody want to jump in? Yomi?
I think it just reached a point. I'll speak from like a first five perspective. I think it reached a point where people just wanted to break away from the negative stuff that they were just kind of coming across as soon as they either flick on the TV, get in their phones, because it got to a point where even if you're not on Twitter or Instagram or Facebook or any of these things, you're still facing this in WhatsApp groups or text messages from family members or friends. You still can't escape it, you know. So I think there was a point where if something was happening online that wasn't pertaining to any kind of trauma or any kind of negative news, people are just going to engage. And I think for the most part, poetry was a really good start to just kind of to ease away from it. But then, you know, because Boxed In was still running, and the first Boxed In session that we ran online, people flooded and was ready for the open mic, and they were ready to read poems. So, and the irony is, as much as you're trying to escape from the trauma, all the poems that we heard was either, you know, COVID related or just kind of like isolation related, everything else. So we were still kind of entering this void, but it was a different kind of processing. It was a different kind of healing that was taking place because it was now becoming a shared experience. So for me, I think it for every artist that kind of creatively thought of something new to do online as a breakaway, it was helpful. There's this gentleman called Munya who does he does these parodies of what's been happening in the government or anything that's going on. So he does it in song, he does it in different raps or commentary or interviews. They have been hilarious. But for the 2-3 minute skits that these things were happening, it gave us just, oh, this is just all a joke when you just kind of break it down. But then when it's done through art, it's kind of taken in a different way. So I think that's where artists really stand out, by taking these elements of what's happening in society and just bringing it forward in a way that's digestible and in a way that has us thinking a bit different, you know. So I really commend those that's taking the time to kind of provide art on an online stream as well.
Yeah.
Hafsah, what do you think? Was there anything that you found in art that you just really, really needed at this time? Or maybe just within your family, was there suddenly this hunger for music or for poetry or for some other form of art?
I think the biggest hunger was comedy. Like, people wanted to laugh, you know, they wanted their spirits lifted. And I can't speak for anybody else, but I know for the first time ever, we were watching things that we'd never watched before, like Britain's Got Talent, America's Got Talent, you know, the Graham Norton show. I can't tell you, it turned into some sort of, you know, ritual that Facebook do these little skits. So you don't watch the whole show, you just see little segments of the Graham Norton show. But I knew that every time I ended up watching a little piece, it just lifted me out of whatever I was in before that. And I think it's just human connection. That's what we're all looking for, really. You know, once we've all confined to our houses, how were we then going to create that same kind of intimacy with people, especially for us that work in the community? You know, the heart of the community is where you will find us. And suddenly we're not able to do that anymore. So there were lots of us looking for new ways of connection, you know, new ways of relating to each other. And, you know, poetry in challenging times is not new. I think everyone turns to poetry when it comes to, you know, war and famine and natural disasters, you know, change of governments, you know, all times of trouble, people do turn to poetry. And for me, I think, even though I wasn't able to write any poetry, the fact that somebody else had already done that for me, and I could read that poem and not be from the same background, not even from the same country, you know, but suddenly in that moment, we connected over those words. It's a beautiful thing.
Mm.
Yeah, no, I think poetry does have a unique role to play in that kind of connection. And also maybe acting as a kind of witness as well for each other. I think poetry is particularly strong for that. Anthony, do you think did you notice an increase in the hunger for different art forms? And do you have any thoughts about what was driving it?
I haven't noticed anything that is different than it always has been, to be honest. But I think that poetry, especially, what draws people to poetry is the same thing that draws people to music. It's immediate. It's an immediacy, and it's living. Poetry feels very much alive. You know, there's an energy to poetry that is almost tangible. If you go to a poetry reading, there's an energy. It's immediate. It's on you. And it's a different experience from something like reading a novel, or, you know, you read a novel, you take some time, you close the book, you come back, you do your life. The poem is on you, you know, and it demands your attention. And I think I think people are touching on that. There's this sort of element of distraction going on in a poem, and an element where it is taking you out of the immediate. And it offers comfort. Poetry is often a space in which we remember or mark a particular point. And I think people have been looking increasingly for things that mark happier times or more sort of contemplative times. Interesting what Hafsah was saying about comedy. Yeah, I definitely agree with that. You know, comedy, you know, I've been watching a lot of Family Guy, you know, it's like, the distraction of that, and the physical act of laughing has been really important. So yeah, I think it's the energy of the spoken or poetry on a page is something that people are going to keep turning to. You know, it's living, it's alive.
Just wanted to add, especially in regards to anything happening on the live, like the Instagram lives or what have you. There's a global impact as well, in a sense of, oh, it's not just me here in London is going through this. Like, right down, you know, folks from South Africa are connected, and we're talking COVID, or we're sharing music, or we're sharing poems. And there were other things in which people from different walks of earth were just kind of connecting in this kind of stream for like an hour. Whereas if I was just running the night, if the team were running the night in Shoreditch, for example, we can only run the night to those that we're talking to. Whereas if we're online, we're having these people connect from different parts of the world, doing open mic for the hour, and they're sharing poems from Sierra Leone, you know, and we got someone sharing poems from Camberwell, you know, in London. And that for me was amazing, because as a team, I know that we'd never thought about, oh, what if we just move this online for like 1 month to really give the breadth of time for people to come and join in and share poems globally. And we never thought of that until something like this lockdown happened, and it provided that opportunity to just open it up. So I think it is something that we are discussing in terms of carrying on at least once every 2 months or something, you know, just give that opportunity.
There have been some amazing international connections and collaborations and all sorts of wonderful things, which I hope will carry on. So we've talked a little bit about how many more people are engaging with the arts, whether it's Netflix or a massive increase, as I said, in the poetry reading and reading in general. But I think we should probably also touch on the other side of that, which is, as I said earlier, there've been a huge amount of cuts in the arts. Probably we're facing more cuts than any other sector. And we have not received as much support as other sectors, even though it is known that arts is absolutely essential. So rather than asking you for your sort of overall opinions and politics, I just want to like keep it a bit personal, if you're happy to do that. How has it impacted on you as an individual artist? I mean, have you guys actually lost work? Were there things which you were hoping to do which then couldn't happen? Or have you been able to carry on pretty much the same?
Yeah, I lost work.
Yeah.
I don't know about everyone else, but
Yeah.
I definitely, it was horrible. It was an absolute, I just sat down. I think there was one straight week where day after day, a new email came in, 2 new emails came in, 3 came in. And I was just like, wow. And then there was just silence for like and you couldn't make the stuff up, because then my boy just ran to me and said, Dad, I'm hungry. And I'm like, oh my God, this can't be happening right now. Because it's almost like, because then it couldn't have, you couldn't have made that scenario up anymore. I'm just thinking, yep, I'm going to make your food soon. And then I'm thinking about what happens 2-3 weeks from now, a month from now. You know, what do you do? And then there's that additional thing of, I don't necessarily want to spread that anxiety to my partner in saying, I'm feeling kind of stuck right now, because in my head, I'm trying to figure it out. All I've been trying to do is just figure it out. Do you see what I mean? But yeah, I'll thoughts, how was it for both of you?
Wow. I lost work. Yeah, of course. I mean, prior to the lockdown, actually the week the lockdown was announced, I was supposed to fly to LA to do this residency
Oh,
for like 4 weeks. Yeah.
Oh.
And that was canceled. But, you know, hey, that's life. It was bigger than me, you know, so I accepted it. The whole thing was people were dying, man. So I was like, okay, this is bigger than me. So yeah, the same with you, with the emails coming in every day, cancellations. But luckily for me, you know, I'm an academic, I'm a lecturer. So, you know, I had that sort of a little bit of a buffer to say, okay, I can pay my rent, you know, I can eat, you know. But if I was a full-time sort of on the ground doing this for a living, yeah, I think I'd struggle. I mean, I did struggle, but I had some sort of comfort, some sort of buffer, because I had an academic job, you know. But yeah, the loss of work, and there's some nice gigs too, you know. You know what I mean? Some really nice gigs were coming up. But I managed to find a way. People try to find a way of working through it, and you know, I ended up actually recording my new album. Not during, you know, at the end of the lockdown period when we were able to go into studios and stuff again. We went straight back into the studio and recorded an album. So work continued, even though it wasn't highly paid. The work still continued, you know.
Yeah, and I was the same. I think when lockdown was announced, again, so many projects that I was involved with, just they didn't know themselves what was going to happen with them. So I was a lot further down the line, and it made me realize, as those emails came through, that how precarious sometimes the life of a freelancer is from commission to commission. And it really made me think, and it still is this what I want to be doing? As much as I love the arts, I'll be honest, there were times where I just thought, actually, I want to leave. And straight away, I'm in between these, you know, two voices. As soon as I say that, even now, my whole body is reacting that you can't leave. You know, this is your passion. This is what you love doing. But sometimes it becomes so challenging to make the work that you want to work. There's so many barriers. There were even without COVID. So COVID just kind of exasperated everything. And also, you know, things had changed so much. I was questioning my own practice. What does it mean now to move forward? You know, I suddenly had to, like you, Yomi, you were saying at the beginning that you were learning that, you know, you were buying all these things to adapt to this new situation. You know, I have a lot of anxiety sometimes being online and on videos and in front of the camera, and, you know, suddenly we're having to do that all the time. That's the only way forward at the moment. So yeah, I think it's been a learning curve. I'm not going to leave the arts. I hope not. You know, I have too much that I want to do, but I'm a true believer in, you know, whatever you're searching for is also searching for you. So it's just a matter of time, you know, that these things will all align and we'll all be in a better place. I think we just have to get through this bit.
Mm.
Thank you guys for being really honest, because I think it's important that people understand when there are cuts in the art, the very, very real implications and results from that. And obviously I've seen a lot of people online saying, oh, this is the perfect time for writers because now you've got lots of time to write. And I think there's a complete failure to understand the anxieties and the difficulties that go along with that as well. So the other thing I wanted to ask, I mean, you three obviously have reached a stage in your careers where you have some buffer in that you have ongoing work and you are probably some of the first people that organizations will reach to. But I've had some younger artists, a lot of younger artists coming to me, and they literally have nothing. They cannot pay the rent. So I was wondering, Yomi, I know you speak to a lot of other artists. How have they been impacted, especially the ones who are perhaps in an earlier stage of their career?
Big. Man, it's and you know, it's a case of how they now find work or what have you, especially if they're not necessarily, because I still have to, I think about here, if necessary, I would, if I've got no work or anything like that, I might just go an email, just start a conversation with X, Y, and Z, and just see, is there anything happening? But I can't say the same for emergent artists that are nervous to even try to say hi. You know, like how do you even say hi? How do you even break a conversation? And I think in those areas, I would offer myself to kind of be like, let's talk through this. You know, do you know of any organizations that you can talk to? Are you online to see what opportunities are happening? Because even in light of COVID happening and lockdown happening, various organizations at the time that were going digital, they were also opening up different kind of competitions or open up different kind of writing opportunities that could pay either between £50 to £200 or what have you, depending on what you needed to, if it matched the criteria. What was required from these artists was for them to be proactive. I think if there's anything before any form of confidence is trying to be proactive enough to be like, all right, cool, this is the situation. It's not about, yep, allow yourself to sit through it as much as you can. But at some point, if you want to try to affect change, what are the steps needed in terms of trying to turn your situation around? And I think that's where I best served in terms of the comms and talking to people. Or like, for those that were ready to try to do something, all right, let's now move. So I set up Coach Chef, for example, which was mentoring sessions online. So if people wanted me to look at poems, cool. But the purpose of me doing that was, I'm going to free up these 2 days in a week. If you have any poems, let's talk about it, because you're interested in now submitting the poems. Let me do my part and submit it if you want. At least I know that I'm trying to help out and support in the best ways I can. But to answer your question, it's been tough for a lot of emerging artists. It's been very, 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 very tough. Not only gigs that have been cancelled, but now in terms of even showing or sharing work, there were nights that were cancelled that weren't online. So now it's almost as if I can't work and I can't share poems. I'm just stuck. I'm just here. Do you see what I mean? So it's nice to see a lot of the nights starting back up slowly but surely now.
Yeah, and I think it's important that people understand that when there are cuts in the arts, you may very well lose things permanently, because there's this, seems to be an expectation of, oh, it'll reopen and then everything will go back to normal. But you've got orchestras that have said they're never coming back, ballet companies, you know, you've got so many people. And as Hafsah said, I mean, even somebody of Hafsah's level is saying, I considered leaving the arts. And I've spoken to a lot of younger artists who really not only considered that, some of them have actively done it. And I think we are actually losing a generation, especially in poetry, because it's not exactly the most lucrative thing in the world anyway. But I think we are starting to lose people. And I think that's a cost that we need to consider. And it is very, very real. Sorry.
I do wonder whether it surpasses just the writer just doing the writing thing, you know, just being the writer, because now it's also calling for them to be entrepreneur in their own right, in terms of, I can't just rest on my laurels and just being a writer. Now I need to think about, especially if something like this, God forbid, happens again, it's a thing of, okay, so there's this writing side of what I do, my skill set, but also do I need to start working on this other side, which is like the networking side or the kind of conversation side, and trying to build a community. So more than often, writers have a writers community, but also what other communities need to be taken into consideration in order to kind of persevere through the difficult points. And I say this to say that, you know, with all due respect to creatives wanting to be creative, there are also other elements in terms of sustaining and going forward that I think needs to be taken into consideration as well.
Well, we've had an amazing discussion. Thank you all for being so honest and open, and really, really exciting for me to hear about the work that you've been doing, and I'm sure for the audience, because you've been doing incredible work during this time, and we're going to be celebrating, looking more at some of that work in the future events of the Poetry Takeover. But I just wanted to finish with something a little bit lighter. So if you are willing, what is the most embarrassing thing in art that you've enjoyed during lockdown? So we've had little tidbits, but does anybody have a particular guilty pleasure that sort of became a recurring theme over lockdown? I know a few people have their lockdown songs, which I find a little bit weird, but does anybody want to jump in? Hafsah, you said comedy. Do you want to go into that?
Wow. The comedy, yeah, I mean, guilty pleasure. I mean, Britain's Got Talent and American's Got Talent definitely both come into that. But my guilty pleasure is that Sunny Sunset, Selling Sunset. One of my kids were watching it, and it's about these people with, you know, set in LA, selling these ridiculously priced houses for a hell of a lot of money. And even though there's a part of me that really dislikes it, I can't stop watching it either. I don't know what's happened to me. You know, there's part of me that keeps on analyzing it, but there's another part that is secretly addicted to watching it as well. It's bizarre. So that's my guilty pleasure.
Yomi, are you willing to jump in? I know you like asking other people what their guilty pleasures are.
I know. Do you know what it is? Mine has to be this game called Animal Kingdom. It's on Switch. I originally bought it for my boy to play, but now it seems like it's my own personal. Basically, you just build your land. You just keep building land, and it's endless what you can do on this piece of land, like what you can create on this piece of land. And I actually saw online last week that people actually done their baby showers. They've done their baby reveal. Sorry, they've done a baby reveal via this game. So there are elements of this game that I don't even acknowledge or even know yet that's very, very, very exciting for me. So yeah, I think there's something about having this endless opportunity to create land on land and all different types of things that's a bit baffling to me, because I'm like, there must be an end point, but there isn't on this game. So it's slowly crept in as like this thing that I'm playing when my boy goes to sleep, and he doesn't know yet because I created a separate profile and he's not aware of it yet. But it's fine. That we can keep that between ourselves and the audience watching. Cheers.
Of course. And Anthony, you probably don't have any guilty pleasures.
I
you're
do.
Probably much too serious for that.
No. Actually, my guilty pleasure has been this American courthouse drama called Paternity Court. Yeah. If you haven't come across it, Google it. I came across it on on Facebook, you know, scrolling through videos on Facebook, and it's like a 20-minute show in which you know, two ladies come on, and there's a gentleman in the middle, and there's a child involved, and they argue for about 20 minutes and try to either deny paternity or say that it's my child, you know. Then at the end, they do a DNA test, and the judge said, "Mr. Smith, you are the father," or stuff like that. It's incredible, but it's funny. It's humorous, but in a way that is sad. But it also, I think, feeds into a need for narrative, you know. It's a narrative, it's a story, you know. So you sit there for 20 minutes. Is he the father? Is he not? And, you know, the dad is like, I know it's not my kid. It's not. And at the end, you see, you are the father. And it's, oh, you know. Anyway, it's funny. And that's been a guilty pleasure, I would say.
Right, actually, you won the unexpected winner of the guilty pleasures. Which
I will
I
get
really
cussed.
didn't
I have to call it
expect at
Animal
all.
Kingdom. I want not Animal Kingdom. I will get cussed so bad by any gamer watching it. They'll be like, crossing, not kingdom, crossing. But yeah, let me just. I don't want to let anyone down on that side. You see what I mean? This is me right now, you know. Well, yeah, go for it.
Okay, so I think we're going to wrap up with that. Just to say to everybody listening, we've got many more events in the Poetry Takeover. If you check out the Jerwood Arts Twitter and the handles of the three poets, you will find lots and lots of more information, and I hope you enjoyed it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.